It's another day in America. Another day in America. Welcome to the America at 250 podcast, devoted to enabling us to see and feel America through the eyes and hearts of others, and as a result, take concrete steps to make America truly great. I'm Kevin Caldwell. And in order to pursue the purpose of this podcast, throughout the project, I'll be inviting a very diverse set of guests to share how they would answer what would make America great. It only seems fitting during this year in which America turns 250. Unanswered questions, 250 years and counting, we're still waiting in America. Well, welcome everybody to this episode of the America at 250 podcast. And today I have a special guest, Tamara Lanier, and I'll be explaining a bit about in a bit how we got to know each other. But as you know, if you've been following the podcast along, this is exploring the various issues involved in wanting America to be great and what it will take for America to be great. And because we're about to celebrate 250 years since the 1776 Declaration of Independence and the fault lines that remained there, fault lines which included issues surrounding indigenous peoples that were here before any of the colonizers came, enslaved peoples that were part of the quote unquote property of the founding fathers and framers of our Constitution and Declaration of Independence, fault lines that have to do with how they viewed women as full human beings and full participants, and fault lines really around class and the way that only property owners were allowed to have say and vote, or at least that was the attitude of most of the framers, is that really only property owners should have a say in government. So these fault lines are still with us, and these episodes are exploring all sorts of things around that. And today, my guest Tamara Lanier and I are going to be exploring one of those fault lines. So, Tamara, just introduce yourself briefly, and then I'll talk a little bit about how we got connected.
Oh, great. My name is Tamara Lanier,
Oh,
and
Tamara, I'm very sorry. Yeah,
mhm, yes, and I please, if you would call me Tammy, that would be so much easier.
sure,
um,
Tammy.
yes, and I am a retired chief probation officer, and I live in the small coastal community of southeastern Connecticut, specifically Norwich, Connecticut. I am the mother of two amazing daughters
Mm.
and the grandmother of two beloved grandchildren. And I am the author of the book From These Roots, My Fight with Harvard to Regain the Cultural Property of My Enslaved Ancestors. And I am very happy to be with you this afternoon.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. And as I'm sitting in California, and Tammy is sitting in her home in Connecticut, right?
Mhm.
And so here we are spanning the United States, which seems somewhat appropriate given the topic
Yes,
we're going to be
exactly.
covering. And Tammy, you mentioned your book, From These Roots, My Fight with Harvard to Reclaim My Legacy. That actually feeds
Mhm.
into how we first got acquainted. So for my audience here, as such as they are, I was driving around in Los Angeles. I think I was probably in town to do some music events that week, and I just happened to turn on NPR to get caught up on the news, and it was in the middle of a conversation that NPR was having with Tammy about her book, From These Roots, and I just knew. It was one of those moments where I just knew that I knew that I knew that I need to connect with her and find out more about the story. And so I did some research, figured out how to reach out to you through social media. So we started to do that. Thank you for responding. But I also
Mhm.
bought the book, and
Mhm.
I read it, marked it up. My wife read it, has added her notes. I've told other people about it. So hopefully that's resulted in a little bit of more people getting connected with your story, because it's a powerful story, And as we'll unpack things in this interview and probably in our second one as well, I do think that there's some themes in it that are
Mm,
bigger than just your story. But I
yes.
want to start with your story. And when I bought the book, what really stood out to me is that it in many ways, your story, although it's highlighting a battle with Harvard, begins with the death of your mother, and
Yes.
in a very, kind of intimate and personal thing. And that's really what led to your introduction, I'll say, quote unquote, to the man you call Papa Renty. So would you just sort of just start us into the story? What happened?
Mm,
And we're going to work our way through the story you tell in the book.
yeah. And I want to share that it was important to me that the readers understood my relationship with my mother.
Mm,
She was my world. We were so very close.
mm,
And she was such an extraordinary woman herself. And I wanted the readers to get to know her. And it was important because, to put things in context as to why I persevered so long, why I fought so hard, why I never gave up, is because I, in my entire life, have never made a promise to my mother that I didn't keep. And
mm,
she never made a promise to me that she didn't keep. My mother meant the world to me. And every time Harvard attacked our family history, our legacy, my mother's remembrances, I took it personal.
yeah,
And that was only because of the relationship with my mother and how much that woman meant to me.
right.
And so she is still my motivation.
Mm,
And I wanted people to get to know the kind hearted person she was and the loving person, the nurturer she was, and
mhm,
what she meant to me. So I opened the book with a chapter. The first chapter is entitled Sankofa,
mhm,
and but what you know, my mother, who was a retired teacher, who talked about growing up in the cradle of the civil rights movement,
mm,
was so proud of who she was,
mm,
where she came from. And, she was not ashamed of the fact that she grew up in the Jim Crow South and the restrictions and the limitations that that placed on her.
mm,
She wore that as a badge of honor.
mm,
And she, when she talked about these things, she talked about it with a reverence.
mm,
And she wanted us to know, that although she grew up in the Jim Crow South, she grew up in a loving and nurturing family. And, she was loved and she was sheltered from the hate that was the result of the Jim Crow.
mm.
But she embraced it.
Yeah. Sounds like an amazing, strong woman, and
She was.
I can see why you're so grateful. Yeah, now you've already referenced a battle with Harvard, and we haven't yet told
Mm,
that whole story, and it has to
yes.
do with this man named Papa Renty. So
Hmm.
tell us more about him, how you got to know him, since you didn't know him, didn't live in the same time as you, right? And so,
Yes.
yeah, introduce us to Papa Renty, if you will.
Yes, and again, this is how I, explain my relationship with my mother. Again, she was a retired teacher. I refer to her in the book as the keeper of our family story,
Hmm.
and I explain what that meant in a sense that traditions in most families are that elders will sit at tables and tell their young and tell their children about their ancestors, about their years growing up and the history and those, lived experiences. And it's shared generationally, usually around holidays, around dinner time, where, elders will just sit back and reflect on their history and who they are and where they come from and impress upon their children that this is important to know, this is important to
Right.
remember. And my
Mm,
mother would do that. often throughout my childhood, we
Mhm.
would sit and she would say to me, I want you to always remember, that we are really Taylors and not Thompsons.
Mm.
And she, would talk about that we descend from this proud Black African who they referred to as Papa Renty.
Mm.
And she would talk about, our ancestry. She would talk about specifically every conversation would start with the proud Black African Papa
Mm.
Renty.
Mm. Mm.
And one thing that she respected most about him was the fact that he was literate.
Mhm.
She marveled at the fact that he learned to read, that he taught himself to read
Mhm.
at a time when it was illegal to do.
Do that.
And
Yeah.
and that he would not only teach himself, he not only taught himself, but he would teach others.
Yeah, that really
And that
came out in your book. I really, yeah,
Yes,
very
yes.
powerful.
And so he went out of his way to ensure that if anyone had a desire to read, he would be
Yeah.
willing to teach them. And he put himself in harm's way by doing this. Historian, or, the keeper of the family story. That was my mother, and she
Okay.
passed that responsibility on to me.
Yeah. But during all this, she was telling you about it, et cetera. You hadn't
Mm.
seen like a picture of him, right?
No,
Till a bit later. So
until,
when did you
yes.
first see his face?
Mm, that is, an experience that I will never forget.
Mm.
And it, at my mom's, my last conversation, my last lucid conversation with my mom, she again, put that responsibility on me. I need you to write this down. And I told her I would. At her passing, I started to have real guilt about that because
Mm.
I'm thinking, I don't know the first thing about genealogy,
Right.
but I promised my mother
I would
that
do that.
this work would be done. Yes. And so I remember I was out walking one day and I was just burdened by this because I was thinking my mom went home to her glory,
Mm.
trusting that this work would be done.
Right.
So this work has to be done.
Yeah. No, no
And
pressure, right? Yeah.
no pressure. So you're gonna figure this out.
Mm.
And and in that moment, I walk into this ice cream shop.
Mm.
It's a small little space, or it was a small. It's no longer open. Rich has since passed on, but there was a ice cream shop owner in downtown Norwich, a man from I want to say it's not Frank, Lebanon, Connecticut. He owned this farm and he had this amazing um, fruit. He had amazing fresh vegetables and fruits in his shop. And so I would stop in to get a salad and pick up my lunch, and we'd make small talk, and then I'd go on my way. So I'm out walking and I'm just really burdened by this responsibility that I have and not knowing how to, navigate and put these pieces together. I walk into Rich's shop and for whatever reason, God put it on my spirit to just bare my soul to Rich, just bare, whatever. So I said to him, did I share with you that my mom passed? And he says, no. And I'm sorry to hear this. And then I start telling him about the promise that I had made to do the genealogical work and how, you know, I didn't know the first thing about it, but I had to figure this stuff out. And he says to me, I love to do this stuff. He says, write down what you know and I will
And I'll
take a
help.
shot at it. Yeah.
Okay.
And so I was like, wow, I was firstly, because Rich was a senior citizen,
Right.
up in age. And I'm like, okay, how is he going to do this genealogical work? But I was grateful for the offer.
Sure.
I wrote down some things. The one thing that I wrote that Rich said helped him in pinning down the fact that Papa Renty was my ancestor was I said, I told him that they called Papa Renty the Black African. He was African born.
Mm-hmm.
And so I gave him some names of children and some details that I could remember off the top of my head, and I walked out of the store.
Right.
And I didn't go back for weeks, but when I did, I walked into his ice cream shop and he was standing at the register. And I will never, this image is seared in my brain of him standing there, throwing his hands in the air, saying,
Mm.
"Where have you
Where have you
been?
been?
I found your
Mhm.
Papa Renty on the internet."
Uh,
And I'm like, what is my Papa Renty doing on the internet? I
Internet.
was like, oh
Yeah,
my
right.
goodness,
Got a
yes.
social media account or what's going on?
Yes, what's that? And so we then exchanged names and telephone numbers and email addresses.
Mm.
And he sends me a link.
Okay.
And the first link I open is the story of Louis Agassiz and this real dark science, pseudoscience about scientific racism and the theory to prove Black inferiority, and this scientific experiment that was
Yeah.
performed on these enslaved people. I'm
And
like,
just for our
wow.
audience, this is Louis Agassiz was part of Harvard. He was a major
Yes,
figure at Harvard at the time
yes,
when he was starting to get engaged with this pseudoscience. And
exactly.
yeah, yeah, I think it was Charles Morton and others that were talking about craniology,
Craniology,
and so
exactly.
but Harvard had him on staff and was very much
Yes,
into this whole thing. So yeah, go ahead.
yes. So I'm like, this is really dark stuff. And I'm wondering what in the world Rich has sent me. Then I see an attachment that says Renty Taylor,
Mm-hmm.
and I click it and I opened it. And what filled my screen took my breath away.
Yeah.
It literally, I had a physical reaction when I saw that. I had I had never seen the image of Papa Renty before. I had heard stories about him for my entire life. My mother had never seen images, just
Mm.
heard stories. And so when I opened that attachment and his image filled my screen, I was really frozen in time
Yeah.
because immediately our eyes connected.
Yeah.
And I felt like I was trapped in that moment where I was just staring at this image
Hmm.
in disbelief.
Yeah.
But the one thing that I knew immediately was that this was the man that I had heard
Mm.
stories about for my entire life. I knew that this was Papa Renty.
Well, and before we began talking today, you sent me an image in which there's a picture of you, and there's superimposed a picture of him, and it's connected to a story that was done in which thousands of comments, wrote in
Mhm.
basically saying, "Whoa, we see the resemblance," etc. So this
Mm,
wasn't just, a subjective experience you were having. And
yes,
I've got it right in front of
exactly.
me right now, and absolutely, I see the connection. And now, did you know at this point what Harvard's involvement in that picture was? Because there's a whole story that
Yes,
we're about to get
yes.
to about why there's a picture of him.
That evening was so traumatic for me
Mm.
because it was very emotional because I just read about Louis Agassiz, the Harvard scientist, and that dark scientific experiment on enslaved people
Mm.
to prove white supremacy.
Yeah.
And now when I look at the image and I know that my enslaved ancestor, the patriarch of my family, was the subject of this experiment.
Right.
I'm like, whoa.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So I'm firstly emotional because this is Papa Renty. Oh
Yeah.
my God.
Who you've heard
And then,
about all through your childhood
yes,
and life.
yes.
And whoa. Yeah. Hmm.
Whoa. And then I'm like, oh my God. My
Yeah.
mom had only passed a few months ago.
Right. So you're still in
Why
grief.
couldn't I have
Yep.
found this a few months ago so that
Mhm.
she could have,
Yeah.
in her lifetime, seen an image of Papa, what that would have. And so, when I talk about an emotional
Mhm.
roller coaster, I was on a ride. And,
Sure.
and I'm like, oh my God, why didn't I find this sooner? Why didn't I know this? And
Mhm.
then I say, wait a minute. make the connection about the scientific racism, the experiment, and the fact that they used Renty, who I know him to be extraordinary,
Right.
a symbol of Black excellence,
Yes.
as a symbol of Black inferiority.
Right.
Whoa. Stop the presses here. Pump the brakes here. This is so wrong.
Mm-hmm. Mm.
And so now I'm starting to get angry.
Yeah.
And like, how dare they? And so I called my girls to my bed. I was in my bedroom. They were in the front. I called them to my bedroom. Look, this is Papa Renty. And they immediately, oh my gosh,
Wow.
Mom, you have his eyes.
Yeah.
Mom, we see, and they're saying that we spend so much time remarking on all that was familiar and the family resemblances and who we saw in him and what about him we saw in me and in others. Um, and my daughter said something that I thought was so profound. She said, when grandma would talk about Papa Renty, I created an image in my mind of who I thought he would be or what he would look like. And I imagined him to be a person like 10 feet tall.
Yeah. Yeah.
And to see, this small,
Mm-hmm.
frail, imagery. She said, it was just so different from the image she created of who she wanted him to be based on the grandiosity that the stories my mom told.
Yeah.
And so we just spent time and like Megan, my youngest, Mom, your eyes, you have his eyes, you have his cheekbones.
Mm-hmm.
And then we also talked about, you know, of all the descendants of Papa Renty, of all the children, and I'm sure that there are thousands, the fact that, we are here, me,
Yeah.
opening an attachment, um,
Yeah.
making this connection and seeing so much in terms of a family resemblance. We talked about the notion of this being just a purpose
Mm-hmm.
driven event,
Yeah.
a smaller part of a larger purpose driven story,
Yeah.
that fate has brought us
Right.
to this moment. Yeah.
Well, let me dig in a little bit to more to the Harvard connection with all this, and just for
Hmm.
our readers, just so they know the historical period. So we're talking about a period of Harvard's history and America's history that begins before the Civil War, but it is happening in the 1800s, and there's Agassiz and uh, Charles Morton, Charles Darwin is coming on the
Hmm.
scene. There's just all this stuff happening historically, and Agassiz commissioned some pictures to be taken, and as part of this whole pseudoscience of proving white supremacy. And very so there's a lot swirling in American history at this point,
Mm.
and this lands right in the middle of that. Um, but yeah, so tell us a little bit about that. So Harvard commissions that, or
Yes.
actually Agassiz commissions a man named
Mm.
to go take these
JT
pictures.
Zilly. Yes.
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, and there is history and context that makes this all make sense.
Mm.
And I don't know in terms of the our podcast and the telling of this when it's most important and appropriate to talk about.
It's,
But in 1850, when the country was divided,
mhm,
almost as where we are today, on the question of race, on the question of slavery and emancipation,
mhm,
the country is divided over this question. And Harvard University, in this moment, steps in to offer a scientific justification for slavery.
mm,
And when I say that, what Louis Agassiz, the Harvard scientist, did was he commissioned these daguerreotypes to be taken, and just to qualify the daguerreotypes. It's a form of photography,
Right.
quite different from photography that we know
It's
today.
not what people would think if we just said photography.
Yeah,
Yeah, but
exactly.
the
But
daguerreotypes were a particular type. Yeah.
yes, and he commissioned J.T. Zilli to take these image of 7 enslaved people. It was important that these be African born,
Right.
untouched
Didn't. Yeah.
by
Yeah.
any
He didn't
white
want
blood or the
any
potential
interaction.
white,
Yeah.
yes,
Hmm.
because he figured that if they had been exposed to white blood, if there was any intermingling of the races, they would benefit and be less inferior if they had white blood. So he wanted a pure type, a pure African. So he traveled to Columbia, South Carolina, to the plantation of Benjamin Franklin Taylor, and what they did was they photographed 7 people specifically in the nude,
Yeah.
pointing to the physical characteristics of each person to show their inhumanity, that this is not human, that they are not of the same blood as he referred to. They're not of the same blood as us.
Yeah.
And so the irony, the people that he chose to prove
Mm.
this white supremacy were people who actually negated the science in its entirety, because these were scholars, these were educators, these were educated people.
Yeah.
I know at least Renty and Delia were, because that's their
That's the
oral
importance of
history.
that. That's the importance of that earlier
Yes,
story where he
yes.
taught himself to read. He was teaching others to read,
Yes,
etc.
yes.
Yeah.
And the one thing that my mom would often say, if you don't know how to read, it is not easy to teach yourself to.
Hmm.
And so I lived not far from Noah Webster's house in West Hartford, Connecticut.
Okay.
I drove up one day and picked up a copy of the Blueback Speller.
Mm.
And the one thing, and if you have an opportunity, you can pull it up on the internet, you can look at it. It is not easy. I like to think, I have, I have a college degree. I
Sure.
like to think that I'm, bright and,
You're
and
you're an
can do.
intelligent person. Yeah.
I know that I could not teach myself
Yeah.
to read using that book if I didn't
Really
have a
hard. Yeah.
foundation
Hmm.
in literacy or it's not easy to
So for
do.
him
So
to have
what
done that, yeah, on his own, yeah,
was an
yeah.
accomplishment. And so, and so the fact that, they used the slaves that they chose to
Mhm.
prove this scientific experiment were the actual proved exactly the opposite.
Yeah.
And so Harvard, and Harvard had ulterior motives, because, and this is something that comes out later in my book, but what we learned is, there was my attorney framed it in a way that, I think really sums up the entire case. Cotton was the thread that held the union together.
Mhm.
And what he builds upon is how equally invested the North was in
Sure.
cotton,
Right.
and that was the one common thread between the North and the South, that they fought on everything else, but
Mm.
the one thing they could agree on is that cotton was the really the catalyst for the economic boom
It
that
was
this
an it
country.
was an economic engine in
It
both. Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they needed it. And
Mm.
so these people, the Harvard and the Harvard leadership at the time, all heavily invested in the Industrial Revolution,
Mm.
and cotton, the thread, the Negro croft, the mills that developed in the North needed the cotton from the South.
So there's a
And
vested interest in proving the
yes,
supremacy and
yes, yes,
inferiority, that they're,
yes,
yeah,
yes.
and just so that our listeners might know, this, Louis Agassiz he was a noted scientist. He
Mm,
do any research on him, audience, you'll find that
mm,
there's a lot of people who speak glowingly of this man as a pioneer in certain education methods and et cetera, but it's in the fields of zoology
yeah.
primarily, and not human biology and physiology. And yet
Mhm.
this is, for some, his interests took him in this direction. And
Yes.
I'm using interests in air quotes, but
Hmm.
um, yeah. And so Harvard's vested interests, his own vested interests, his own reputation, his own
Exactly.
ego gets involved in this. It's a very big story. But without getting into
Yes.
all that, that launches. That's kind of the backdrop, and we've gone
Mm.
from like the discovery and hearing the stories and being kind of tasked as the storyteller and the keeper of the
Hmm.
heritage by your mother, and then seeing the picture, and then
Mm.
going all the way back to the 1800s and Harvard. You mentioned a moment ago you're a lawyer, and so that's already a
Mm.
hint that there
Hmm.
came about a battle.
Yes.
And really, as you know, from my reading of the book, it started with a very simple thing. These are
Yeah.
my ancestors. I would like their
Mm.
pictures.
Yeah. And
Uh,
it even starts a little bit more simpler.
okay.
After reading and discovering, and rich, in addition to the information about Louis Agassiz and the scientific experiment, also put together a very comprehensive genealogical tree for me that
Mm,
traces my lineage to
right,
Renty.
right.
So I reach out to Harvard, and I think I asked for just two very basic things.
Mm,
Firstly, to look at my genealogical research that I had at that moment, which was compelling.
hmm.
You see the direct line, and to acknowledge that I'm a lineal descendant of Renty. And I also asked them to, share with me how you plan to moving forward, talk and use the daguerreotypes and talk about Renty's legacy. It was important to me that when they spoke about him, what they would do is celebrate Louis Agassiz as this premier, you know, academic scholar, and
Hmm.
marginalize the enslaved people who he had used to create. So I said, Renty has a rich oral history and a legacy that defines him as, you know, exemplary, Renty was an educator. There's so much more to him. You keep saying he's invisible. Tell
Right.
Renty's story
Yeah.
and acknowledge this
Yeah.
racist scientific experiment was, a bust.
Yeah.
So, and I put this in writing in a letter to Drew Frauss, the president at the time.
Hmm.
Two very simple requests:
Yeah.
to look at my genealogy and tell me if you see what I see,
Right.
and tell me how you plan moving forward to work with the daguerreotypes.
Yeah.
To this moment that I sit here with you on this podcast, Harvard has never sat down with me to
Mm,
look at my genealogy
mm,
and to have me explain to them why I feel that Papa Renty is a direct descendant, that I descend directly from him.
mm,
And they've never answered the question for me as how they plan to move forward with the daguerreotypes. Never. The two very basic things that I asked.
yeah.
And so, I was the response that I got from Drew Faust was very dismissive.
Mm,
It was very non-responsive to the specific things that I asked. There was no invitation to say, okay, we have, some of the best genealogists in the
right.
world.
Right.
Let's sit down and go over your
So,
genealogy. Because they had written books, they had done periodicals, they had done documentaries, they had done seminars, international seminars about Renty, and projecting who they wanted or surmised him to be.
hmm.
They were not interested in hearing his true legacy,
Right.
my story of his ancestry. They did not want to know. I think they were bothered by the fact that I reached out to them to
Mm,
suggest that they would entertain anything that I have to say. And so the one thing that they would say publicly, and they've said this to the press, is that I could never prove that I'm a lineal descendant of Renty.
right.
And each time they said that, it
Mm,
became more of a challenge to me to prove them wrong.
Okay.
And so I just continued building on the already comprehensive genealogy that I had, continued reaching out. And, the one amazing thing that I think shines through in this story is that this became a international community project because people from all over the world, when they heard this
Mm.
story, their response was, "What can I do to help?"
Yeah. Yeah. Which I think actually begins to, I said at the very beginning of our conversation that in many ways your story, which is very specific, very grounded in individual people and history
Mm, mhm.
and events, to me has like a metaphor or a kind of almost a archetypal mythic side of it that speaks to a lot of
Mm,
things in our country as a people and how we deal
mm.
with things in the past. Because it speaks to things like privilege and power and self-protection and institutional protection and historical amnesia that we choose to have.
Yes,
And
exactly.
and you bring those up really powerfully in the book,
And
actually.
academic arrogance.
Yes. Yeah.
I ran into that not only at Harvard, but the scholars who were working on researching these enslaved people to identify them. I reached out to them. They did not want my input.
Mm.
They were scholars. This is what we do, and we don't need help from you.
Yeah.
That's the kind of arrogance I was up against.
And one of the things you bring out in the book that touches on this is kind of and I've seen this in some of my other interviews with other people as we've talked about First Nations and Indigenous peoples, et
Mm,
cetera, is a sort of, and I'm going to classify it this way, kind of coming out of the European quote unquote Enlightenment
mhm,
and a preference to written texts, written history, etc., as opposed to oral heritage, oral tradition,
mm,
as if somehow that's a lesser thing. And I
exactly.
think even some of my audience is going to be like, well, yeah, written, if it's not written down, if I can't find it in the library, not
Mm,
as true as someone telling me the story. And I know you encountered that.
yes,
As you and that I
yes.
think that's some of that arrogance probably.
It is. It is. And, it's true in so many cultures
Mhm.
because the keeper of the story, I actually, I live in Southeastern Connecticut and I can look out my back door and see the Mohegan tribe and the Mohegan Reservation. And a few
Yeah.
miles down the road
Mhm.
is the Mashantucket Pequots. But I was at their museum and
Mm.
at the Mashantucket Museum, and there was a film, the history of the tribe, and it starts with an elder and a little boy,
Mhm.
and him saying to him that always remember, and that you are now the keeper of our story.
Right.
And I got chills from that because
Mhm. Mhm.
I saw in that my mother to me, putting that, and it is, it's certainly a privilege for an elder to say to you,
Mhm.
I'm going to entrust you with our family story, but it's also a burden and a responsibility
Right.
because you have work to do now to share this story.
Right.
And I know that it's not exclusive to Native American or African American families.
No,
I
it's a
know that
global issue.
all
Yeah.
families,
Mhm.
and what they do is they tell, this is who we are.
Mhm.
And, I write about in the book, I say that our elders did not trust history books to
Mhm.
tell our story. So what they did was they embedded these stories in the hearts and the
Yeah.
minds of their children, charging them to always remember and to never forget and be the keepers of this very important legacy. And this is who we are from firsthand accounts
Yeah.
that aren't necessarily reflective in a book. And a
Yeah.
lot of times, what is written about us is what other people want
It,
us to be, or what they, yeah, and not who we
yeah.
are.
Thank you. That's the thing I was going to draw out a few moments
Mhm,
ago when you talked about not trusting what's written in books, because there are,
mhm,
I think there's a myth that, well, if it's written, then that's objective and that's
mm,
true and
mm,
that has no bias in it, et cetera. And if it's spoken, then there's bias and that could be subjective. But the
mhm,
decisions, I mean, we've all heard that, history's written by the ones who won, um,
mm,
and privilege and power and position deciding what can
mhm.
be printed and not, what gets kind of, what books get burned, uh,
Yes.
literally or figuratively,
Mhm.
published or not published, et cetera. Those all have very weighted decisions behind them. They're not
Exactly.
objective, neutral decisions.
Exactly.
Mhm.
Exactly.
Yeah,
And not necessarily a truer picture
exactly.
of
Right.
the lived experience of who they are writing about. And that's, like I said, my mother and the story she told, she did not see many of these documents. But when I'm going back and doing the genealogical work, it's as if my mother was reading from these documents. She
Yeah.
never saw them, but that's how accurate
Yeah.
our oral history was.
Yeah.
And my mom never saw these papers. She never saw these documents. She never saw these wills and these,
Yeah.
names written, but she would call it off just as if she was reading from it. It was written with, our history was so accurate. And that's what I marvel by, because again, this is something passed down 200 years now.
Yeah.
And we are talking about it today with a degree of accuracy that amazes me.
Yeah. Well, and if I could, I think there's a couple things I want to draw out in this first in this initial interview and episode, and we're going
Mhm,
to be following this up with more, uh,
mm,
another one, and we'll actually
mhm,
turn the corner and start asking, okay, so how does this speak to
mm,
America at 250, and
mm,
what kinds of things need to happen for us to be
mhm,
great. But I think if I could, I want to kind of fast forward. We started in the quasi present, and we went
mhm,
back, and then we
mhm.
came into the sort of battles with Harvard so a bit. But where are those pictures now? Where is Renty now?
Wow. Okay. So that's a loaded question.
I
I
know.
mean, with a very simple answer. They are currently at the International African American Museum in Charleston, South Carolina, a community that my research bears out is where Renty's children resided, where one of Renty's descendants built that community.
Mm,
Books have been written about him and his mastery, his carpentry, and the skillful work that he has done to build
mhm,
that part of South Carolina. So I know that Renty's children resided there. My great grandfather, Renty Taylor Thompson, lived in Charleston, South Carolina, for most of his young life. So that is where Renty and Delia are currently.
mm.
And in May of, no, it was in March of this year,
March of
Harvard
23.
tra- yes, Harvard transferred the daguerreotypes to the International African American Museum.
Okay.
And it was part of an agreement, a settlement, a resolution of the case.
Yeah.
And so they are essentially home. They have gone back to their
That's really
place of
interesting.
origin
Yeah.
in South Carolina. Yeah.
Really, really interesting. So that's where the daguerreotypes are.
Hmm.
They were kind of hidden away in
Yes.
Harvard's back rooms. That's where they
Hmm.
are now.
Hmm.
The book tells this story, and we don't have the space to retell the whole story. I want my
Mm,
listeners to buy the book and read it
mm,
from these roots,
yes.
Tamara
Yes.
Lanier.
Hmm.
But if you could kind of summarize, like, how was the decision made that this is where they would end up?
Now, that is,
And I know that's
there's
the
this,
whole book in a way,
yeah,
but and we keep
but no,
developing.
I, in the legal case, and, we'll talk a little about that at some point, but there was a decision by the court. And, the case that we brought, we asked Harvard to return the daguerreotypes or to surrender the daguerreotypes to the descendants of the enslaved people.
Right.
And Harvard refused. We did take them to court, and initially the first lower court dismissed our case. We 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 filed with the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court, where there was a landmark decision. And keep in mind that this is the first time in modern history that an enslaved person has petitioned a court for their freedom.
Mm,
This is the first time in the history of this country that a case involving the cultural property of an enslaved person has survived a motion to dismiss and was given an opportunity for a jury decision.
mm,
All other reparations cases have been dismissed for lack of standing.
yeah.
And my case was able to move forward primarily because, firstly, I could prove I have standing
Yeah.
to bring this case on behalf of Renty and Delia as their ancestor. And what's also unique about this is also when we talk about reparations, but there's also the notion of repatriation.
Yeah.
Um, in the history of this country, at least I have looked and I have not found another case where the cultural property of an enslaved person has been repatriated back
Yeah.
to its home community. These things have never happened before in the history of this country. That's why this case is so unique, because it embraces so many complicated, so many loaded issues like reparations, repatriation,
Mm,
plunder, and so this case, the court agreed our case would go forward to a decision, but they also said Harvard could keep the pictures.
mm,
Like, wow. So we knew, because, when a state Supreme Court rules, that's the law of the land for that state.
right.
To challenge that, there's no district court or whatever. You go straight to the United States Supreme Court if you don't agree with what the state Supreme Court said.
Hmm.
So when the court ruled that Harvard could keep the pictures, I was extremely disappointed. I was excited about all the novel issues that our case had raised and that we had prevailed, and
Right.
that, we were moving forward and we could go forward and all of these amazing new things that had never happened before.
With the
But
exception of this thing, right?
the big thing
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
Harvard got to keep the pictures.
Hmm.
And I just could not accept that. Though my attorneys, in the best way possible, they tried to get me to see that this is really the best possible decision the court could have made for me. And I agree. I do agree. One of the things is, it the attorneys tried to point out that I do not want to inherit or receive the pictures, the daguerreotypes, because what that opens the door for anyone who can prove they're a relative of mine or a descendant of Renty could then sue me for interest in the daguerreotypes, and that I would be embroiled in legal cases probably for the rest of my life.
Well, and
That I
yeah, and I think your motivation all along wasn't really about you
It
either.
was,
Yeah.
yes. And so, yeah, and it was never about, there was never a financial gain for me. It was about, firstly, defending my mother's honor and Renty's humanity.
Yeah.
And secondly, Harvard, as the wrongdoer, can never be the ethical stewards of these cultural relics. They cannot remain with Harvard because they were responsible for the initial bad act that created them.
Right.
And it was a criminal act, which the attorneys pointed out, because in the state of Massachusetts in 1850, they had abolished slavery.
Mm,
So what Harvard did was a crime. They committed a crime. And so they, as the wrongdoer, could not benefit from the fruit of their
To,
crime.
go back to my
It's just
phrase, that
basic
this is a fault
jurisprudence.
line
Yeah.
in their ethical
Yes,
uh,
yes, yes. And so, but we had to accept that we could not go to the US Supreme Court and that we had to accept Mass's decision that Harvard gets to keep the pictures,
yeah,
which was a tough pill for me to
sure.
swallow. But in my book, in the last chapters, one of the last thing that I wrote about, I said, I vow to never stop naming,
Right.
blaming, or shaming Harvard until they do the right thing.
Hmm.
And in the acknowledgments, my concluding paragraph was, I am going to claim this victory in advance.
Hmm.
Even though Harvard has no legal obligation to do it, they're
They've
going to,
still got their, yep, daguerreotype.
yes,
Yep.
my the cultural property of my enslaved ancestors will be transferred to
Mhm.
a proper final fitting place, and that did happen.
Yeah. So if you could, we're going to wrap up here in a minute, but just so how did it finally get there? Just if you could summarize that.
Hmm. Well, I think the book had a lot to do with it
Sure.
because,
Yeah.
like I
It
said,
stirred up
it
a
is
lot
a
of attention.
tell-all,
Yeah.
and this was not a good look for Harvard at all.
Yeah.
I mean, every other Harvard is the premier academic institution in the world,
Hmm.
one of the most richest academic institutions in the world. Their dowry is worth more than many countries' budget. I mean, Harvard
Yeah.
is a beast.
Right.
They are.
So this was
Um,
tarnishing their image
yes,
yeah.
and so they reached out to the attorneys. A few months after the book, I had been doing book tours where I was talking about the book and promoting the book, and it's all in there. And they reached out to the attorneys and said, "Let's talk."
Hmm.
And so, and the trust had been broken because we have tried to negotiate and talk. And what we learned is that Harvard never came to the table in good faith.
Right.
And there was always an ulterior motive for them wanting to come to the table and talk. And it was always usually a stall tactic that they had something else to hit us with, and or to surprise us with. So I was not trusting when they said, let's talk. I'm like, okay, what are they up to now? And so they were willing to surrender the daguerreotypes and would transfer them to the museum that I chose. And initially, now this is the other thing that, again, when I talk about just fate and how things just fell into place so neatly, I really wrestled with this in the beginning. I knew Charleston was home for the daguerreotypes, but one of the things that I also weighed was the Smithsonian in DC, a
Mm.
larger museum, much
Right.
more foot traffic,
Right.
much more a larger venue with an opportunity for them to be seen on a larger scale. And we really seriously talked about that. And the attorneys, we decided to just take a beat for a minute and think about this. And then in the wake of that, just like within a day, we see this rolling attack on institutions that are teaching Black history,
Yeah. Right.
specifically museums, and
Yep.
an attack on Black artifacts and Black culture and erasure and all of this other stuff.
Pulling people off of websites and
Exactly. And so the International African American Museum is not federally funded.
okay.
So the
As
U.S.
opposed to the Smithsonian
as
and yeah.
opposed who they could lose funds if they don't. So if we had gone with the Smithsonian, conceivably the daguerreotypes could have been shelved.
Right. And you would have already given up the say in that.
Yes, yes.
That's really, really, amazing, amazing story, painful story.
Mm, mm,
Again, as I've said a couple times, I think it's a paradigmatic
mm.
metaphor as well
Yeah.
for a lot of things. And that's where we're going to go in our next conversation. And I really appreciate you've already brought up, some of the topics that cause people to just want to run away and shudder. or
Mm.
shudder and run away. Reparations,
Mhm.
recreation. These are very
Mm.
thorny, difficult issues, but your story is a
All
story,
of that.
right? Um,
Yeah.
the suppressed history, uh,
Mm.
which we're seeing attempts at suppression of history, that would
Erasure and,
erasure,
just so.
hiding things away. Let's take pictures off and put them away
Mm.
somewhere.
Mhm.
You're touching all those kinds of things,
Yeah.
but also the role that that speaking truth to power, speaking truth in public can have,
Mm.
and actually the impact that a single individual who's
Mm.
received a commission, if you will, from
Mhm.
her mother, uh,
Mhm.
and who just puts one foot in front of another and says,
Yeah.
I'm gonna do what my mother asked. And
Mm.
that's
Yeah.
really what began all this, in many
Mhm.
ways. And
Yeah.
so I want to touch on all those things because I think as America turns 250, so to speak,
Mm.
how to become great is going to bring
Yeah.
us back to facing a lot of these kinds of things.
It
And
is. It is.
I look
And
forward to exploring that with you.
yeah. And the other thing that I feel obligated to mention,
Please, yeah.
and we can talk about that next time too, is my meeting with Dr. Edmund Taylor, the descendant of the slaveholder Benjamin Franklin Taylor,
I would
and the
actually,
grace that he
yeah,
showed me. And it's bizarre because my kids were like, "Oh no, you're not you." But like I said, the
that's
grace that he showed me, and yeah,
That's
amazing.
actually, I'm really glad. I was actually about to bring that up. Earlier, you had mentioned woodworking and all
Mhm.
that kind of stuff. I actually want to open the next episode with you with that scene
Mm.
being him and
Yes.
and all that adds to the story in multiple dimensions, and then we'll kind of step into, okay, how do we become great? So
Yeah.
that's if we could start there with our next.
Absolutely.
I think that's a
Yes.
beautiful segue, because that story has a lot of elements to it.
It does. It does.
So
And I just, I know there's a lot of apprehension about having these conversations, like with the Agassiz family. We're like sisters now, but there's so much. So I just look forward to our next discussion because I want to share so that
yeah,
people,
yeah,
who are doing this work or thinking about this work can understand. Certainly it's an emotional journey, but it's also a journey for healing too. And so it's an important conversation.
yeah, and I think that unlocks an element of what will make America great that many people overlook. People tend to jump to
Yes.
legislative things, or even with reparations, they'll jump to kind of official big examples of that.
Hmm.
Those are important to
Hmm.
talk about. I'm not minimizing.
Hmm.
But some of your story is these direct human
Yes.
relationships, and
Yes.
with that could be very difficult. But you pressed into those things, and I want to unpack some of that the next time that we meet.
Okay.
Okay. Tammy, thank you so much for this time. I really appreciate
Okay. And I look forward to our next conversation.
it. Right. So to all my audience out there, stay tuned, and I hope you'll join us for the next interview with Tamara. All right. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Next time.
Bye bye.
Maybe someday in America, another day in America, maybe someday in America.